Before we begin this first chapter, take a moment to settle your breathing. Let your shoulders drop, and allow the room to become still around you. Tonight, our story moves slowly, deliberately, through centuries of human attempts to touch the mind and reshape it. Our story begins in the deep shadows of prehistory. Long before anyone spoke of nerves or synapses, long before physicians debated madness in marble lecture halls, and long before surgeons carried silver instruments into dim hospital wards, in those ancient worlds the mind was not an organ. It was a spirit, a wind, a drifting presence that could be touched by gods, stolen by demons, or shattered by curses. And yet humans already tried to cure it, not with words or medicines, but with stone tools and trembling hands. The first chapter of this story takes us to a windswept plateau near modern-day Ensaïm in France, where archaeologists uncovered skulls more than 7,000 years old, each marked by a strange and deliberate opening carved directly into the bone. These openings, smoothed at the edges, reveal something extraordinary. The earliest known form of brain surgery, trepanation, a brutal, simple act, cutting a hole in the skull to let spirits out or let healing forces in. We imagine a small settlement at dawn, smoke rising from huts, a patient lying on a woven mat, chest rising and falling in short, uneven breaths. A practitioner, not yet a surgeon, not yet anything resembling the physicians of later ages, kneels beside them with an obsidian blade. The air is cold, the tribe gathers, and then, slowly, carefully, he begins to scrape. Why? Because the mind frightened them, and because suffering demanded an answer. Even in these earliest communities, depression, psychosis, seizures, and violent behavioral changes were part of human life. When someone screamed through the night or wandered the forests murmuring to unseen figures, their people searched for explanations. If a spirit could enter the mind, perhaps it could also be released. These ancient procedures were not born of cruelty. They were born of terror, hope, and the overwhelming desire to fix what felt broken. But something remarkable appears in the archaeological record. Many of these patients survived. The bone around the openings shows thick healing. That means people lived for months, years, sometimes decades after the procedure. They carried a literal window in their skull, a permanent mark of humanity's earliest attempts to rewrite the mind. While early Europe turned to trepanation, another thread of this story was unfolding thousands of miles away in the dusty, sun-baked landscapes of Neolithic Peru, where more than 800 trepan skulls have been recovered from burial grounds. Some show single openings, others show multiple attempts, 3, 4, even 5 circular cuts, each one a desperate effort to calm inner storms. How many of those storms were psychiatric? We will never know, but the pattern is unmistakable. Humanity's first response to mental suffering was physical intervention. And yet, even this violent ritual was only one path in a much larger, much older journey. By the time written language emerged in Mesopotamia around 3000 BCE, a different narrative began to shape the world's understanding of mental illness. In the clay tablets discovered at Nineveh, tablets inscribed with wedge-shaped cuneiform text, we find some of the earliest descriptions of ghost, sickness, hand of the god, and the wandering mind. Here, madness was divine punishment. Curing it required priests, chants, oils, burning incense, and appeals to celestial forces. Medicine existed, but the brain was still untouched. The heart, not the mind, was believed to guide thought. To change behavior, one had to change fate. However, this belief system did something crucial. It separated madness from character. Mental illness was no longer the patient's fault. It was a condition, an affliction, something inflicted upon an innocent human being. It was not yet science, but it was a beginning. As centuries passed, our story moved across the Mediterranean to ancient Egypt, where physicians of the Old Kingdom recorded their observations on papyrus scrolls. Among the most famous texts is the Edwin Smith Papyrus, dated around 1600 BCE, which describes brain injuries in meticulous detail. It lists symptoms of skull fractures, memory loss, paralysis, and behavioral changes. Yet even here, the mind remained mysterious. The Egyptians knew the brain existed. They removed it during mummification with metal hooks. But they still believed the heart housed thought, emotion, and identity. If surgeons of this era opened skulls, it was only by accident. The idea of altering the brain to heal the mind had not yet been born. It would take another 1,000 years for the next major shift. As we move into ancient Greece, our story begins to deepen. Here, in the narrow stone streets of Hippocrates' world, a radical idea emerged. Perhaps madness was not divine punishment. Perhaps it was biological. In the Hippocratic texts written around the 5th century BCE, we find the earliest medical theory linking the brain to mental life. From the brain, one passage reads, "Come, laughter, sorrows, and tears." This was a turning point. It meant that something physically wrong with the brain could change a person's very essence. Yet Hippocratic healers still believed in balance, not surgery. They attempted cures through diet, bloodletting, purges, and baths. The mind was a system to stabilize, not a machine to alter. However, something darker lurked beneath the surface. If the brain controlled the mind, then damaging the brain might also control it. Here, the earliest conceptual shadow of lobotomy begins to form. Across the Aegean, another voice rose, Galen, the brilliant Roman physician of the 2nd century CE, who dissected animals, studied gladiator wounds, and theorized that the brain's ventricles, its hollow chambers, were the seat of mental life. Galen's ideas dominated medical thought for more than 1,400 years. His writings shaped European medicine, Islamic medicine, and later Renaissance science. Yet even Galen, who believed the brain was the source of thought, never imagined deliberately cutting it to treat mental illness. The idea would have seemed unthinkable. What mattered next was not surgical action, but philosophical groundwork. This early association brain equals mind planted a seed that would one day grow into something far more catastrophic. Meanwhile, far from the marble streets of Rome, in the dense forests of the Indus Valley, healers developed complex systems of mental health care. Ayurvedic practitioners classified emotional disturbances into categories resembling depression, anxiety, and mania. They treated with herbs, meditation, balanced diet, and rituals. In ancient China, physicians of the Han Dynasty described Dian and Quang, disorders of withdrawal and agitation. These conditions were attributed to imbalances of qi. Treatment focused on restoring harmony, not cutting through bone. Across continents, early civilizations agreed on one thing: mental suffering needed healing, but their methods diverged. Some looked outward to spirits, some looked inward to bodily systems, but none yet turned a knife toward the brain willingly. But then, in the quiet archives of later centuries, another set of clues emerged from medieval Europe. During the Middle Ages, mental illness became tangled with spiritual warfare. Monasteries housed the suffering. Exorcisms replaced medicine. In the illuminated manuscripts of the era, we find depictions of demons crouched on shoulders, whispering into ears, twisting minds. The idea of opening the skull returned, but now through myth and allegory. In one painting from the 15th century, titled The Extraction of the Stone of Madness, a robed surgeon attempts to remove a literal stone from a patient's head, a symbolic cure for insanity. The scene is satirical, mocking the arrogance of physicians who claimed to fix madness through physical means. But satire often reveals truth. The very act of imagining madness extracted from the skull shows how deeply people believed that the mind could be physically altered. And here, in this strange medieval metaphor, we see the first cultural ancestor of the lobotomy, a belief that the root of madness could be physically removed. As we pass into the Renaissance, the world changed again. As scholars rediscovered ancient Greek texts and artists studied anatomy with renewed fascination, physicians began dissecting human cadavers with scientific rigor. Andreas Vesalius, in the 16th century, mapped the brain with unprecedented precision. His illustrations were detailed, elegant, terrifying. They revealed a structure of impossible complexity. Yet, even with this new knowledge, surgeons still refused to operate on the brain. It was too delicate, too sacred, too risky. However, something else was happening quietly in the background. In the psychiatric wards of Renaissance hospitals, patient conditions were recorded with greater detail than ever before. Physicians described symptoms of hallucination, melancholia, mania, compulsions, and violent outbursts. They recognized patterns. They saw cycles. The idea of the broken mind became clinical, not moral. And as institutions grew, so did frustration, so did hopelessness, so did the desire for a treatment that could calm the chaos. By the time we reached the Enlightenment, mental illness was slowly shifting out of the realm of religion and into the territory of medicine. Philosophers debated free will, identity, and the nature of reason. Physicians like Philippe Pinel in France argued that people with mental illnesses were not cursed or possessed. They were patients. They deserved dignity, compassion, and care. Yet even compassion revealed its limits. By the late 18th century, asylums overflowed. Patients screamed through hallways. Some were chained to walls, others rocked silently in dark corners. Families begged for relief. Physicians begged for answers. And while we often imagine the history of medicine as a steady ascent toward improvement, it is, in truth, a long corridor littered with mistakes, misjudgments, and tragic innovation. Because when desperation grows, people become willing to try anything. As the 19th century dawned, a new scientific revolution lit the world. Electricity crackled across laboratories. Microscopes magnified cells never seen before. And deep in the medical schools of Europe, anatomists began slicing into the brains of animals. They observed behavior shift when specific regions were damaged. They mapped functions. They realized the brain was not a singular organ, but a constellation of interconnected systems. This realization changed everything, because for the first time in history, surgeons saw the possibility, not yet the intention, but the possibility of altering behavior by altering the brain itself. This is where the earliest conceptual roots of lobotomy truly take shape. Not in ancient rituals, not in forgotten spiritual practices, but in the cold, brightly lit laboratories of the 1800s, where scientists used electrical probes and fine knives to chart the geography of thought. Yet even now, no one dared propose cutting the human brain to treat mental illness. Not yet, not until a storm of social pressure, scientific arrogance, overcrowded asylums, and misguided optimism converged in the early 20th century. But that comes later. But then, something changed. The world would never be the same after the 19th century brought science closer to the brain than ever before. New instruments, new theories, and new ambitions crossed paths in a way that felt almost inevitable. A slow, steady march toward a treatment that promised to quiet the mind by cutting its very wiring. The second chapter reveals a profound transformation, how centuries of caution suddenly gave way to bold experimentation, and how hope, arrogance, and desperation braided themselves into a single, dangerous idea. Our story begins in the early 1800s, when physicians started experimenting with animals in earnest. Laboratories across Europe echoed with the soft squeak of metal tools, the sharp smell of disinfectant, and the uneasy realization that behavior could change dramatically when specific parts of the brain were damaged. In 1811, the English anatomist Charles Bell proposed that different regions of the brain controlled different functions, a revolutionary claim during an era when many still believed in a unified soul organ. Bell's experiments on rabbits and dogs laid early groundwork for neurolocalization, but it was the great French physiologist Pierre Flourens who pushed this concept further. In the 1820s and 1830s, he conducted controlled lesions on pigeons, chickens, and rabbits, removing small parts of their brains with surgical precision. When he removed the cerebellum, the creatures lost balance. When he removed the cortex, they lost will, initiative, and recognition. When he destroyed deeper regions, they lost the ability to live altogether. Flourens reached a conclusion that echoed through the scientific world. Different regions of the brain produced different forms of behavior, and as these findings spread, young scientists began to dream of the implications. If behavior could be changed by injury, could it be changed intentionally? While Flourens was mapping function through absence, another figure was generating maps of his own, but without a scalpel. The German physician Franz Joseph Gall, working earlier in the century, developed phrenology, the belief that bumps on the skull reflected underlying brain strengths and weaknesses. Even though phrenology was eventually debunked, it introduced one powerful idea, that personality was directly tied to physical brain structure. This connection, thought equals brain matter, changed the cultural mood. People began imagining the mind not as a spiritual essence, but as something physical, material, and alterable. By the mid-1800s, Europe erupted with new findings. Paul Broca, a quiet, meticulous French surgeon, encountered a patient in 1861 named Louis Victor Leborgne, known simply as Tan because it was the only word he could say. Broca discovered that damage to a specific region of the left frontal lobe had destroyed Tan's ability to speak. That region would forever bear Broca's name. A decade later, German neurologist Karl Wernicke identified another region that governed language comprehension. Piece by piece, the brain was losing its mystical aura. It was becoming a map, a landscape, and landscapes could be reshaped. But something else was happening at the same time, something darker, quieter, and more desperate. Across Europe and America, asylums were overflowing. By 1850, institutions in London, Paris, Vienna, and New York housed thousands upon thousands of patients. The Industrial Revolution had swollen cities beyond capacity. Poverty, trauma, and illness poured into crowded wards. Physicians struggled to manage conditions such as schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, severe depression, and catatonia conditions they could describe with precision but could barely treat at all. The contrast was striking. In laboratories, scientists claimed the brain could be understood. In asylums, physicians confronted suffering they were powerless to ease. And this gap between scientific optimism and clinical despair would open the door for some of the most drastic interventions in medical history. To understand how the modern lobotomy took shape, we must also travel to Texas in 1848, where a railroad worker named Phineas Gage became the unintentional subject of a groundbreaking case study. When an explosion sent a 3-foot iron tamping rod through his skull, entering the cheek and exiting the top of the head, Gage not only survived, he walked away speaking, but his personality changed. He became impulsive, rude, reckless. Friends said he was no longer Gage. This singular tragedy changed neuroscience forever. It proved that damage to the frontal lobes could dramatically transform behavior, and if damage could cause such profound change, then perhaps, in the minds of some, Carefully controlled damage could fix other problems. A dangerous thought, a thought that would linger. By the late 19th century, the world was ready for bold solutions. But first, electricity entered the story. Physicians discovered that electrical stimulation could provoke muscle movement and sensory responses. In the 1870s, German scientists Gustav Fritsch and Edward Hitzig applied electrical currents to dog brains, discovering motor control centers. Later, David Farrier repeated similar experiments in primates. His findings influenced psychiatric theorists who dreamed of resetting the brain. However, even as the scientific groundwork strengthened, no one had yet attempted to deliberately destroy brain tissue as treatment. That would require something stronger, a belief that mental illness was incurable except through drastic means. And to see how that belief bloomed, we shift to the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the turbulent era of asylum reform. As we move into the 1880s, the famed British psychiatrist Henry Maudsley argued that severe mental illness was rooted in biological disease, something inherited, degenerative, and irreversible. His writings shaped psychiatric theory for generations. At the same time, eugenics began poisoning public health policy. Across the Western world, influential figures argued that mental illness was hereditary, and that society had a duty to intervene. The idea was chilling: protect the public by controlling those deemed unfit. This ideological backdrop, combined with massive asylum overcrowding, created an atmosphere in which drastic treatments felt not only acceptable but necessary. Meanwhile, new surgical techniques emerged: anesthesia, antiseptics, better instruments, safer operating rooms. What had once been fatal was becoming survivable. So all the ingredients were in place: overcrowded institutions, limited treatments, biological theories of mental illness, a culture drawn to radical solutions, new surgical capabilities, scientific confidence bordering on hubris. The stage was set. And then, in the early 20th century, a Portuguese neurologist named Egas Moniz stepped into the story. He would become the architect of the modern lobotomy. But before we reach Muniz himself, we must first understand the intellectual environment that shaped him. In 1910, a Swiss psychiatrist named Gottlieb Burckhardt attempted something unprecedented. He operated on 6 patients in a remote asylum in Switzerland, removing portions of their cerebral cortex to reduce hallucinations and violent behavior. His results were mixed. Some patients grew calmer, others died, and one attempted suicide. The medical community was horrified. Burckhardt was ridiculed. His work was buried. For decades, no one followed in his footsteps, but his notes survived, and one day Mies would read them. However, as Burckhardt's work faded, another revolution in psychiatry began to unfold. Physicians experimented with extreme treatments: insulin shock therapy, metrazole-induced seizures, and eventually electroconvulsive therapy. These methods produced unpredictable results: some improvement, many injuries, numerous deaths. And still, asylums swelled. Patients were strapped to beds. Rooms echoed with screams. Families begged for something, anything that could help. This is the moment when Muniz enters history. Born in 1874 in Avanca, Portugal, Antonio Egas Muniz was a man of ambition. Trained as a neurologist, he became a prominent political figure before returning to scientific life. By the 1930s, he was searching for a breakthrough, something that would place him among the great innovators of medicine. In 1935, he traveled to London to attend a presentation by 2 American scientists, John Fulton and Carlisle Jacobson, who had conducted frontal lobe experiments on chimpanzees. When portions of the chimp's frontal lobes were removed, the animals appeared calmer, less agitated, more manageable. Muniz sat in the audience, silent, mesmerized. If this works in chimpanzees, could it work in humans? This question would change the world and cost thousands of people their identities. When Muniz returned to Portugal, he made a decision that would reshape psychiatric history. He would attempt to cut the connections between the frontal lobes and the rest of the brain. Not to remove the lobes entirely, but to disrupt the pathways he believed carried pathological thoughts. This would become the prefrontal leucotomy, later known as the lobotomy. He designed a device, the leucotomy, a thin cylindrical instrument with a wire loop at the end, inserted through small holes drilled in the skull. It allowed surgeons to rotate the loop and sever white matter tracts inside the frontal lobe. In 1935, Muniz performed the first modern lobotomy on a woman suffering from severe depression and anxiety. When she became calmer afterward, he interpreted this as success. Over the next months, he performed more operations, 20 in total, and presented his results to the world. Many were horrified, but many more were intrigued, because for the first time someone claimed to have a surgical treatment for severe mental illness. Hope began to overshadow caution. Throughout Europe, newspapers reported miraculous transformations. Patients who had once screamed and clawed at walls now sat quietly, smiling, folding linens. Manus argued that the surgery freed them from obsessive thoughts, violent impulses, and emotional turmoil. He published glowing reports. He minimized complications. He downplayed fatalities. And slowly, a movement began. By the late 1930s, psychiatric hospitals across Portugal, France, Italy, and the United States sent physicians to observe Manus's procedures. Some returned home convinced, others returned skeptical, but nearly all agreed on one thing: something new was happening, something bold enough to capture a desperate world's attention. Moving into the 1930s, the scientific community found itself divided. Some hailed Manus as a visionary. Others warned that severing brain tissue would reduce patients to shells. But even critics could not deny one thing: psychiatrists had no other options. This is where the transformation accelerates, and where our story lurches toward its darkest chapters, because in a few short years, another man, an American doctor named Walter Freeman, would take Manus's idea and carry it to extremes Manus could never have imagined. He entered overcrowded wards, selected patients on the spot, and operated on them while students took notes. Hospitals lined up their most challenging cases: violent, screaming, suicidal, unpredictable, and Freeman transformed them in minutes. Silence replaced chaos. Stillness replaced rage. Order replaced disorder. To administrators and exhausted staff, it felt like salvation. To Freeman, it felt like triumph. But beneath this calm surface lay devastation, because what they called quiet was often a loss of personality, a flattening of emotion, a soft erasing of the human spark. Many patients emerged childlike, confused, indifferent. Some lost memory, some lost autonomy, some lost the ability to care for themselves, and some lost the ability to speak, plan, reason, or control their bodies. Still, demand grew. By 1949, more than 5,000 lobotomies were performed annually in the United States. By 1951, the number exceeded 20,000. State hospitals asked for more. Families signed consent forms without understanding the risks. Newspapers published glowing stories: miracle surgery brings peace to troubled minds. New treatment offers hope for the hopeless. And just when the world needed caution, it received applause instead. That same year, Igas Manus won the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for developing the lobotomy. The award validated the entire movement. It silenced critics. It emboldened practitioners worldwide. Even today, the Nobel Foundation has never rescinded it. But numbers alone do not reveal the human cost. To understand this crisis, we must enter the rooms where real lives fractured. Margaret was a mother of 3 from Iowa. After years of postpartum depression, her husband brought her to an asylum. Freeman performed a transorbital lobotomy in 6 minutes. She emerged calm, quiet, obedient. But she never recognized her children again. She spent the rest of her life in a state hospital, folding towels in silence. Daniel, a decorated World War II veteran, returned home with severe PTSD. Flashbacks, insomnia, anxiety. Military doctors recommended Freeman's procedure, calling it a modern cure. After lobotomy, Daniel could no longer form long-term memories. He wandered away from home repeatedly, unable to understand where he was. His wife eventually sent him to a veterans hospital, where he died at 39. Evelyn, age 12, suffered from severe mood swings. Her parents were told the procedure would balance her emotions. Afterward, she lost bladder control, stopped attending school, and spent her teenage years institutionalized. Her story mirrors that of another young girl, perhaps the most famous lobotomy patient of all. Rosemary Kennedy, sister of future President John F. Kennedy, underwent a lobotomy in 1941 at age 23. Hers was one of Freeman's early operations. The result was catastrophic. Rosemary, once high-functioning, was reduced to the intellectual capacity of a toddler. She lived the rest of her life hidden away in a Wisconsin facility, her story largely suppressed for decades. Tragedy accumulated quietly, one patient at a time. But how did this happen at such scale? And why wasn't it stopped sooner? Part of the answer lies in timing. Between 1940 and 1950, the United States had almost no psychiatric medications. Treatments were extreme because the alternatives were non-existent. Another part lies in culture. Physicians trusted new technology. Hospitals trusted authority. Families trusted physicians. And Freeman, with his confidence, charisma, and relentless evangelism, filled the role of a savior in a system drowning in suffering. He presented lobotomy statistics that downplayed death rates. He exaggerated success stories. He ignored long-term consequences. When complications occurred, seizures, hemorrhage, infections, cognitive decline, Freeman simply argued that the mental illness was to blame, not the operation. But the truth was quietly documented. Mortality rates ranged from 5% to 15%, depending on the technique. Roughly one-third of patients suffered severe deficits. Another third became docile but functional. Only a small fraction truly improved. Yet the procedure's momentum was unstoppable. And then came the breaking point. The death of Helen Mortensen in 1951, Freeman's third fatality at the same hospital. He had performed a second lobotomy on her, believing it would enhance results. Instead, she hemorrhaged and died. Freeman was banned from operating there again. But he continued on the road for years, performing thousands of procedures until 1967, when one final tragedy, a fatal brain hemorrhage during a transorbital operation, ended his surgical career permanently. By then, the damage was done. Globally, more than 50,000 lobotomies had been performed. In the United States alone, estimates range from 40,000 to 55,000. In the United Kingdom, at least 17,000. In Scandinavia, more than 9,000. Entire psychiatric wards were reshaped. Entire families were altered. Entire lives were erased. And just as the world began to question the ethics of lobotomy, a quiet pharmaceutical revolution was rising, one that would mark the beginning of the end for this devastating procedure. But that transition belongs to the next part of our story.
As we approach the modern age, the world stands on the edge of a quiet but profound shift. The 1960s arrive with a mixture of hope, suspicion, and transformation. The frantic pace of lobotomy's rise begins to slow. The once celebrated miracle cure is now whispered about with discomfort, its promises weighed against an accumulating archive of shattered lives. And at the center of this transformation lies a discovery that would alter psychiatry forever. It begins in 1952 in the laboratories of Poulenc in Paris, where chemists developed a new antihistamine called chlorpromazine. Initially intended for surgical sedation, it produced a striking effect. Patients became calm, organized, less tormented by hallucinations and delusions. The world had just witnessed the birth of the first modern antipsychotic. Physicians tested it on schizophrenic patients with severe agitation. For the first time, some improved without shock therapy, without insulin coma, and without surgery. The drug was soon renamed Thorazine, and its arrival marked the beginning of the psychopharmacological revolution. While lobotomy severed neural pathways, Thorazine muted their intensity, and in the eyes of many psychiatrists, a pill was preferable to a blade. By 1955, Thorazine was widely used across American hospitals. By 1960, it had spread to Europe. By 1965, more than 50 million people worldwide had taken it. And slowly, as medications improved, lobotomy began to fade. However, its decline was not immediate. The 1960s were a decade of contradiction, a period when old ideas clung to life even as new ones replaced them. Some countries phased out lobotomy quickly. France largely stopped by the mid-1950s. Germany halted most operations by 1956. Canada significantly reduced procedures after 1960. Others held on longer. The United States continued into the 1960s. The UK performed operations into the early 1970s. Nordic countries, surprisingly, performed some lobotomies into the late 1970s. Each country's story reflects its own pressures, assumptions, and policies. But the central turning point, the moment when lobotomy truly began to collapse, came in 1967, when Walter Freeman's surgical privileges were permanently revoked after a fatal complication. His final patient died from a brain hemorrhage during a transorbital lobotomy, and the operation ended not with applause, but with silence. Freeman, once the procedure's most vocal champion, was forced into retirement. He spent his final years traveling, visiting former patients, documenting their long-term outcomes, and reflecting on the arc of his own ambition. Meanwhile, the world was changing around him. The 1960s and 1970s saw the rise of social movements demanding patient rights, informed consent, and medical accountability. Investigative journalists began exposing the abuses and horrors that had festered inside psychiatric institutions for decades. Public trust eroded. Legislators introduced reforms, families questioned doctors more openly, and psychiatric hospitals, once enormous warehouses of human suffering, began to empty under the process known as debt. But as we drift deeper into this era, the shadow of lobotomy does not disappear. It stretches into every corner of modern psychiatry. For example, in Scandinavia, particularly Sweden, Denmark, and Norway, lobotomy became intertwined with eugenics programs. Many operations targeted women labeled difficult, melancholic, or sexually uncooperative. Some were teenagers, some were mothers, some were simply too outspoken. In Sweden, more than 4,500 lobotomies were performed, many without consent. Government reports released decades later revealed systemic abuses. Families received apologies. Victims were compensated, but recognition came painfully late. Similarly, in the United Kingdom, where more than 17,000 lobotomies occurred, internal investigations showed uneven training, inconsistent documentation, and vast differences in patient outcomes. And in the United States, the numbers were staggering. 50,000 lives touched, 50,000 families changed. 50,000 histories rewritten, but the procedure's impact extended far beyond the patients themselves. It reshaped public perception of psychiatry. It transformed hospital systems. It influenced laws, ethics, and human rights debates. Even after lobotomy disappeared from operating rooms, its presence lingered in textbooks, courtrooms, and cautionary tales.
In the 1980s, when new neurosurgical procedures emerged, such as cingulotomy for severe OCD ethicists, repeatedly invoked lobotomy as a warning. They emphasized safeguards, consent, rigorous trials, and strict oversight. The memory of the mid-20th century haunted every new decision. And yet, while lobotomy declined, psychiatric surgery did not die. It simply evolved. By the 1990s, a new technique entered clinical practice: deep brain stimulation (DBS). Electrodes were implanted into specific brain regions to treat Parkinson's disease, tremor, and eventually treatment-resistant depression and OCD. Unlike lobotomy, DBS was adjustable, reversible, and guided by years of neurochemical research. Still, critics whispered familiar questions. How much control over the mind is too much? Where is the line between treatment and transformation? What lessons had humanity truly learned? The shadow of lobotomy shaped these debates, but the transformation of psychiatry was not only scientific, it was cultural. The 1960s and 1970s saw artists, filmmakers, and writers turn lobotomy into a symbol of institutional oppression. In 1975, Ken Kesey's One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest reached global audiences through the film adaptation starring Jack Nicholson. The story's climactic scene, the lobotomy performed on Randall McMurphy, ignited public outrage and cemented lobotomy in the cultural imagination as a brutal tool of control. Music, too, carried the theme. Songs referenced lost minds, surgical scars, and broken spirits. Literary works portrayed characters erased by psychiatry. Newspaper columns demanded accountability. The world was waking up, but while cultural depictions condemned lobotomy, medical journals approached its legacy with uneasy caution. Some argued that the procedure was a product of its time, an act of desperation in an era with no alternatives. Others insisted that the medical community had failed catastrophically, blinded by hubris and willing to sacrifice individuality for convenience. The debate never fully settled, but by the end of the 20th century, one fact was undeniable. Lobotomy had become a symbol of medicine's darkest potential. And yet, the story does not end here, because as we shift into the 1990s, another wave of transformation begins to reshape psychiatry. A wave built on neuroscience, genetics, imaging technologies, and evolving philosophies of mental health. MRI and PET scanning allowed scientists to observe the living brain in unprecedented detail. Activity maps revealed neural circuits responsible for emotion, fear, memory, and decision-making. Suddenly, the brain was no longer a black box, but a visible, dynamic organ. Researchers discovered that severe depression, OCD, and schizophrenia involved distinct patterns of neurotransmission, receptor imbalance, and neural dysregulation. Pharmaceutical treatments became more targeted. New classes of antidepressants, SSRIs like fluoxetine Prozac, entered widespread use. Mental illness began to shift from moral failure to biological challenge, from stigma to science, from punishment to treatment. Yet this progress carried its own complexity. While modern medications spared millions from institutionalization, they also raised questions about long-term dependence, side effects, and the limits of biochemical intervention. The philosophical debate remained. Where does treatment end and personality alteration begin? The ghost of lobotomy lingered in these conversations. Subtle, silent, cautionary. Meanwhile, legal changes reshaped the landscape. Patients gained rights to refuse treatment. Hospitals faced strict oversight. Informed consent became a cornerstone of medical ethics. Professional guidelines emerged for psychosurgery requiring independent review boards, patient advocates, and transparent reporting. No psychosurgical procedure would ever again be performed casually, quickly, or without clear evidence. Yet even with its decline, lobotomy did not disappear entirely. Small numbers continued globally, particularly in Japan, Russia, and parts of South America, often for severe OCD. Most were highly controlled, but the ethical discomfort remained. And this discomfort fuels the continuing impact of lobotomy even today. It influences how society speaks about mental illness. It shapes trust or mistrust of psychiatric institutions. It forces clinicians to consider the morality of intervention. But perhaps the deepest impact lies in the quiet aftermath. The survivors who lived into the modern era. Some patients from the 1940s and 1950s lived well into the 2000s. Some spent decades in institutions. Some returned home but struggled with lifelong disability. Some recovered partially and found ways to rebuild their lives. Some never understood what had been done to them. Their stories remind us that history is not abstract, it is lived. It echoes. Research on severe mental illness moved from crude theories to complex neurochemical models. And yet, even with modern advances, the question remained: how do we treat the most severe, treatment-resistant forms of mental illness? This question is where the legacy of lobotomy becomes most visible. In the 2000s, a new branch of highly controlled psychosurgery emerged, one grounded not in guesswork but in decades of neuroscience. Procedures such as anterior cingulotomy, capsulotomy, and later deep brain stimulation (DBS) became options for patients with extreme unresponsive OCD or depression. These surgeries used MRI-guided precision, computer modeling, and reversible adjustments. Unlike lobotomy, they were not performed on large populations. They were not encouraged as cures. They were offered only when everything else failed and only with rigorous consent. Still, the comparison lingered. Researchers referenced lobotomy as a warning. Meanwhile, cultural memory continues to evolve. Films, books, and documentaries revisit the mid-century psychiatric era with renewed sensitivity. The figure of the lobotomized patient appears not as a trope, but as a symbol of the unintended harm medical authority can inflict. University ethics courses teach lobotomy alongside other historical medical failures, such as forced sterilization and unethical experimentation. Legal systems also reflect this shift. Modern mental health laws emphasize voluntary treatment whenever possible. Patients have the right to refuse medication. Psychiatric holds must be justified. Psychosurgery is regulated with layers of safeguards. Yet even with these protections, global disparities persist. In some regions, especially in low-resource settings, psychiatric care remains limited. Medications are scarce. Hospitals are underfunded. Stigma keeps families from seeking help. And here the fear is not a return to lobotomy specifically, but a repetition of its underlying lesson, that when society feels overwhelmed, the most vulnerable may suffer first. But the story of lobotomy in the present day is not only about caution, it is also about remembrance and healing. Across the United States, United Kingdom, and Scandinavia, historians and journalists have spent the past 2 decades uncovering hidden files, interviewing survivors, and documenting the forgotten. Their work has brought recognition to victims whose names were once lost in hospital archives. In Sweden and Norway, compensation programs were implemented for victims of involuntary psychosurgery. In Australia, families petitioned for acknowledgement. In the U.S., advocacy groups honored those affected. Museums and archives curated collections of instruments, case files, and photographs, not as spectacles but as memorials. The narrative has shifted from scientific failure to human cost, from a treatment breakthrough to a social tragedy, from forgotten patients to remembered individuals. Yet perhaps the most striking aspect of the contemporary story lies in how completely lobotomy has become a metaphor today. The word is used in public discourse, not medically but symbolically, to represent loss of autonomy, suppression of free will, and the dangers of unchecked authority. Headlines use it to critique censorship, rigid corporate structures, or dehumanizing institutions. The surgical operation is gone, but its psychological imprint remains. And so, in the early 2020s, as the world faces new mental health challenges, rising anxiety, widespread trauma, growing awareness of neurodiversity, The lessons of lobotomy serve as a compass guiding modern ethics. We understand more about the brain than ever before. We have more tools, more therapies, more compassion. But we also know the cost of rushing toward solutions without humility. Meanwhile, cultural memory continues to evolve. Films, books, and documentaries revisit the mid-century psychiatric era with renewed sensitivity. The figure of the lobotomized patient appears not as a trope, but as a symbol of the unintended harm medical authority can inflict. University ethics courses teach lobotomy alongside other historical medical failures, such as forced sterilization and unethical experimentation. Legal systems also reflect this shift. Modern mental health laws emphasize voluntary treatment whenever possible. Patients have the right to refuse medication. Psychiatric holds must be justified. Psychosurgery is regulated with layers of safeguards. Yet even with these protections, global disparities persist. In some regions, especially in low-resource settings, psychiatric care remains limited. Medications are scarce. Hospitals are underfunded. Stigma keeps families from seeking help. And here the fear is not a return to lobotomy specifically, but a repetition of its underlying lesson, that when society feels overwhelmed, the most vulnerable may suffer first. But the story of lobotomy in the present day is not only about caution, it is also about remembrance and healing. Across the United States, United Kingdom, and Scandinavia, historians and journalists have spent the past 2 decades uncovering hidden files, interviewing survivors, and documenting the forgotten. Their work has brought recognition to victims whose names were once lost in hospital archives. In Sweden and Norway, compensation programs were implemented for victims of involuntary psychosurgery. In Australia, families petitioned for acknowledgement. In the U.S., advocacy groups honored those affected. Museums and archives curated collections of instruments, case files, and photographs, not as spectacles but as memorials. The narrative has shifted from scientific failure to human cost, from a treatment breakthrough to a social tragedy, from forgotten patients to remembered individuals. Yet perhaps the most striking aspect of the contemporary story lies in how completely lobotomy has become a metaphor today. The word is used in public discourse, not medically but symbolically, to represent loss of autonomy, suppression of free will, and the dangers of unchecked authority. Headlines use it to critique censorship, rigid corporate structures, or dehumanizing institutions. The surgical operation is gone, but its psychological imprint remains. And so, in the early 2020s, as the world faces new mental health challenges, rising anxiety, widespread trauma, growing awareness of neurodiversity, the lessons of lobotomy serve as a compass guiding modern ethics. We understand more about the brain than ever before. We have more tools, more therapies, more compassion. But we also know the cost of rushing toward solutions without humility. In the quiet that follows this long journey, we find ourselves looking back across thousands of years of human attempts to understand the mind. We have walked through ancient rituals, early medical theories, crowded asylums, shining laboratories, and operating rooms filled with hope and misunderstanding. And now, here at the edge of the present, we pause to reflect on what this history reveals about who we are. The story of lobotomy is not simply a story about a surgical procedure. It is a story about us, our fears, our compassion, our mistakes, and our deep need to bring order to the chaos we cannot explain. For as long as humans have suffered in their minds, others have tried to help them, sometimes with wisdom, sometimes with courage, sometimes with blindness. The truth is that medicine has always moved through uncertainty. Each era believes its knowledge is complete. Each generation trusts its own confidence. Yet history shows us that every solution carries shadows, and even the best intentions can lead us down unexpected paths. When we look at the lives touched by lobotomy, we see not statistics but individuals. People who laughed, worked, argued, dreamed, people who trusted their doctors, people who were loved by families who only wanted peace. Their stories remind us that the human mind is fragile, irreplaceable, and deserving of the deepest respect. But there is another lesson here, a quieter one. Progress is not a straight line. It bends, it stumbles, it learns. And with each step we understand a little more about the limits of our own certainty. Today, neuroscience stands more advanced than ever, yet more humble than ever. Treatments are safer. Ethics are stronger. Voices that were once silenced are now heard. We know that the brain cannot be approached with haste or arrogance, but only with patience, care, and profound humility. As this story comes to an end, we sit for a moment with gratitude. Gratitude for the survivors who carried their stories forward, for the advocates who fought to protect patients' rights, and for the quiet, steady progress that continues to shape the future of mental health with caution and compassion. And now, as the room softens around you and your breath becomes slow and even, we allow the final thought to settle gently. The story continues. Every discovery we make, every patient we meet, every question we ask about the mind, All of it becomes part of this long, unfinished human journey. So let the day fall away. Let the world grow still. And if sleep comes, let it come softly. Good night.